but always feel free to start and stop the video in case you... Welcome, band students. This video is going to be about how to practice on your instrument, okay? So there's a lot of material I'm going to cover here. I'm going to go a little quickly, but always feel free to start and stop the video in case you need to hear a point again or something like that, okay? So, first, some tips for practicing, okay? For practicing, number one, have goals when you practice, okay? Have something you want to accomplish. At the end of this session, I want to be able to do whatever, okay? I want to be able to play these 4 measures. I want to be able to know my accidentals. Whatever it is, have goals when you're practicing. Staying focused. Stay focused while you're practicing. That also goes with playing in an environment that's not distracting, right? If you're playing in, your family room and people are walking by or the TV's on or something, it's probably not a good place to practice. So focus when you practice. Only focus on practice. Don't have your phone by the side. Don't have your computer on. Don't have your iPad going. Just really focus on the practice alone. Okay, don't have other distractions outside. Practice regularly. Practice on a normal basis. It's good to practice every day, but I get realistically you can't. Okay, it's impossible. But practicing regularly is really going to help. Whether it's a couple days a week, and you only need to practice, 30 minutes, hour a day. You don't need to do 5-hour practice sessions, right? If you practice regularly, you'll be in good shape. If we have a test coming up or something, and you're really trying to practice at the last second, that's not really going to be as beneficial to you at all, as opposed to regularly practicing, okay? Start at a slower tempo if needed. So whatever your piece is, especially if it's a faster technical kind of piece, always feel free to start slow. You can always adjust your tempo as you move on. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Listen to yourself. This is a big one. Listen to yourself while you play. If you hear something, you're playing something and it sounds not right, or it sounds bad, or it sounds whatever, chances are you're making a mistake. And you need to do something fixing, whether it's a note, a rhythm, your tone, articulations, maybe dynamics, whatever it is. Listen to yourself when you play. Okay, really, and with that, you can record yourself when you play too. Recording yourself and listening back and really focusing on just how you're playing and listening to how you're playing really does help you become a better player as well. Practice is the only way to get better. That goes for anything in life. If I'm a basketball player and I want to work my free throws, the best way to get better at free throws is to simply practice free throws and do it. It's the same thing with music. Practice music. It's the only way to get better at it. There's no shortcuts. There's no, YouTube or social media videos showing you how to, do something very quickly as far as music. You just got to practice and do it. Okay, it takes time. To increase speed for a piece, start slower and gradually build to the tempo. It's like we were talking about. If you have a faster technical section in your music, start slow in your metronome. Whether it's, let's say your tempo is supposed to be here. Start really slow and gradually accelerate the tempo with your metronome until you get to the desired tempo that you want. I would actually practice a little faster than the tempo you want just to make sure so you can adjust accordingly. Like cross-country runners, you run more than your 2.5 miles in practice. So when you do your meets, you're more than prepared. Your body can handle that. It's the same thing with practicing, and especially increasing speed with playing music. Try to practice every day. Like I said, it's hard to practice every day. I would say try to practice a few times a week, but make the most of your practice sessions. Have a focused practice session and really take your time and commit to the practice session that you have. Tackle your demons. This is a big one. Demons meaning work on the things that need to be worked on. Work on the things that you don't do well. If you're playing something and it sounds really good, chances are you don't need to practice that, okay? Only practice the things that you struggle with or don't do well with. Sometimes it's fun to play songs and I sound really good and I'm going to play the song. That's good once in a while, but that's not really practicing. That's more just like kind of running and having fun with the piece, okay? Which is good too. That's good once in a while, but when you're practicing, work on the things that you're struggling with. Don't do the things you do well with, okay? If a section is difficult, don't abandon it. Don't just give up and say, oh, well, I guess I'll move on for now, okay? Don't give up on it. Still commit to it. Now, if you get to a point where you're playing it and you're super frustrated, you're like, I just need a break for a sec, that's fine. But don't just totally abandon it and say, well, I guess I just couldn't get that, okay? Take some time and, and I'm going to show you some steps here about what to do, but take your time and work through the difficult parts, okay? Take it slow, build it up. Look at fingering charts. All these things, they'll really help you with that.
Most people have no clue that in 2023, the best way to make money on Amazon
When
is
did you
not
get
with physical
monetized?
products.
What?
Alternate between fast and slow. Don't only practice slow things. Don't only practice fast things. And you should not. And we'll talk about what things you should be practicing as far as music. But don't just practice the same kind of things over and over. Once you're good at something, you don't need to practice it as much. If I'm good at my B flat scale, you probably don't need to do your play your B flat scale every day. Okay, just things like that. Okay. Check for tuning. Playing in tune is very, very important. Always check for tuning. Have a tuner handy when you're playing. Tune individual notes, tune passages, things like that. Always work on your tuning and intonation. Lastly, practice everything, not just notes and rhythm. A lot of times we think we're doing really well on a piece. We have our notes and rhythm. It sounds good, but maybe that's all we're getting. We're not getting the dynamics, the articulation, the style. Whatever it is. We want to get all of these things. Once I got in my mindset of saying a wrong dynamic is just as bad as a wrong note. Missing a staccato is just as bad as missing a wrong note. Missing a rest is just as important as missing a note or a rhythm. Really committing to everything on the page and over-exaggerating the things that are written on the page will make you a really better player as well. Don't just do notes and rhythms. Do everything. Dynamics, articulation, style, phrasing, whatever it is, okay? So practice everything at once. How are we doing on time here? 6 minutes, good. Okay, so what are some things how to kind of start a practice session, okay? Usually you want to warm up, just like we do in class, right? You warm up. Sometimes you'll do scale. Again, you don't have to do all these things all the time. Do them once in a while. Warming up, you're physically warming up your body and your instrument, especially for wind players. You're warming up your instrument. That's what a warm-up is. It gets your body going, gets your mind in gear for what's coming ahead. Okay, it's not really like learning how to play something, right, for a warm-up. You're just supposed to be able to physically warm up your instrument and your body and get your mind engaged and ready to practice. Okay? Practice long tones. Long tones are huge. Practice playing long tones at a consistent volume with solid air support and with a tuner. And try to get notes so they're stable for the tuner, so you're not wobbling, you're not going sharp or flat, okay? Practice some range studies, okay? You don't want to warm up with a ton of range things, like don't be screaming really high notes in a warm-up, but it's good to practice a little bit of range, whether you're doing octave jumps or fifths or things like that. Range is a really good thing to practice, and not just for warm-ups, okay? Dexterity, get your fingers moving. Practice some passages where you know, B flat scale, you can do it really quick. Da 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 da. And practice getting your fingers moving as well. You want your body to warm up, your fingers are a part of that. Whether it's up here with your fingers, down here, whatever it is. Flute, up here, whatever it is. And tune during your warm up. So I would recommend tuning right away. When you get your instrument out of the case, put it together, you don't tune right away. You want to warm up your instrument first and then tune. Okay? Because when your instrument's cold, it's going to tend to be flat or just not in tune in general. Warm up your instrument with air flow through your instrument, and then tune, okay? But always tune in your warm-up. That's the one thing you should always do when you warm up, is always tune at the end of the warm-up, okay? Some things to practice when you're practicing in practice sessions. All the things above in the warm-up. So the scales, the long tones, range studies, dexterity, tuning. Practice all those things, okay? You don't just have to do them for warm-ups. You can practice them all the time. I still practice those things all the time. You're never too good to practice these things, okay? I still do scales, and I know them really well, okay? Always practice them. Etudes or short excerpts and things like that. Etudes are nice. Etudes are kind of like short studies, usually musical. They sound musical. And they're studies, some technical studies or, lyrical studies, helping you play different styles and different techniques with instruments. I have a lot of etude books here that you can always use if you're saying, Mr. Cram, I'm kind of bored with my music that we're doing. Can you give me something a little more that's different? Etudes are a good way to go. So you can always ask me for that or look them up. Solo repertoire. Playing solo repertoire for your instrument. Let's say I'm an alto sax player. I look at solo repertoire for the alto sax. Okay, learning instead. It's nice because you're playing melodies, especially usually when you're doing a solo repertoire. Okay, so practicing just things besides the music you're doing in class is really important. And ensemble music, whether that's in band class doing band, orchestra class doing the orchestra music, whatever it is. working on the music that you're doing with a group, whether it's a small group or a big group. Practicing that as well. How are we doing on time? We're doing okay. Goals and habits. So when I start your practice, identify what you need to practice. Okay? Don't just go in just saying, I guess I'm just going to play some notes and do whatever. Identify what you need to practice. I'm looking at the section. I know I'm not good at this rhythm and this bar. I'm going to really focus on that. Sight read the piece or the section first. Do the whole thing first. If it's like a 4-bar excerpt, read the 4 bars first before you start working on the details. Read it through first. Then, focus on the problem areas. So you just played it, you sight read it. Focus on the areas that aren't good, whether it's the notes or the rhythm or the dynamics or fingerings or phrasing or whatever it is. Okay, focus on those areas. Don't focus on the things you're good at. If it sounds good, you don't need to practice it. Fix the spot slowly and gradually increase the speed. We already talked about that. Start slow and gradually build up to the desired tempo. Once you have that tempo situation figured out, practice transitioning in and out of that section. So let's say you have 4 bars here that you just worked up and you got your tempo and you're all solid, you're good to go. Practice the first measures before that and then practice a couple measures after that. So you practice transitioning in and out of that section. Okay? Once you fix all the problem areas, you run the entire piece or the section and see how it is. If there's still errors, okay, not silly mistakes, sometimes we make silly mistakes, but if there's still errors like, you still don't got it, go back and do these steps again. Okay, there's nothing wrong with that. And sometimes, like for me, sometimes I have to do this 4 or 5 times. It's really, it can be frustrating, but by the end of it, I'm really happy because I know I got it, I fixed it, okay? Some resources for you. Fingering charts. Fingering charts are a big resource. It's never acceptable to play wrong notes in fingering, especially at a high school level. We should assume we know our notes and our fingerings. But if you don't, and there's something there, or there's a weird trill fingering, or something you're not quite sure of, look at a fingering chart. There's nothing wrong with that. My YouTube lesson videos, like this video, I make a bunch of videos about different things and how to there are certain techniques on different instruments. Look at those for resources. Use your tuner, use your metronome, okay? Use those things to practice. Always tune, always use a metronome. And recordings, listen to music. Listen to the stuff you're supposed to be playing. Listen to music in general. The best way to get better at music is to simply listen to it. I always tell people, listen to music if you want to get better at music. Listen to good players. Listen to good groups. Listen to good tone, okay? If you have any questions about how to practice, always feel free to ask me. Thank you very much.
Slay. Overall, at the end of these last 2 minutes, I think I learned better how to do the steps like what we did today in class. During lunch, when you helped me and Christina, we started slower on a very fast part of Faust, and we slowly worked through the rhythms at a slow tempo, and then we gradually accelerated, like you mentioned in the video, which helped us to develop better and to develop a better sound, a better tone. We were playing the right rhythms. We were playing it closer to the right speed, but we didn't get there exactly. But also, as what you said in the video, since we started practicing earlier and regularly, instead of just trying to cram the night before the final, it'll help because even though we didn't get there now, if we keep going, we'll get there in a couple days after practicing and slowly increasing little by little. And then furthermore, from what you said, if we then use that opportunity to start making it a little faster, if we keep practicing, then we can get to the desired tempo. We know we're set. We can really reinforce the idea of what tempo we're supposed to be at and what we're supposed to be doing. Thank you. $136 for Faust.
Thank you.